Europe thought they found the perfect weapon. In March 2024, they seized $105 billion in Russian assets. No domestic taxes, no political cost. Just take the money and give it to Ukraine. It looked brilliant. For exactly 2 weeks. Then Russia responded. They didn't freeze European assets. They didn't complain to the UN. They did something far more devastating. Russia nationalized $120 billion in European corporate assets. Volkswagen? Gone. Shell? Gone. Siemens? Gone. 30 years of investment erased overnight. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. China bought everything, and I'm going to show you exactly how Europe just committed one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in modern economic history. Let me take you back to February 2024. The war in Ukraine was grinding through its third year. Ukraine was burning through cash. European voters were exhausted from writing checks. Brussels was under immense pressure. And then someone had what seemed like a brilliant idea. Russia has $105 billion sitting in our banks. Why not just take it? Think about it from their perspective. These weren't physical assets Russia could defend. These were central bank reserves, sovereign wealth fund holdings, investment accounts, just sitting there in Frankfurt, in London, in Paris. Now here's where it gets interesting legally. Freezing assets during conflict? That's standard. That's what sanctions do. But actually confiscating them? Actually transferring ownership? Giving them to another country? That's unprecedented for a major economy's sovereign reserves. European lawyers worked overtime finding a pathway. They crafted creative legal justifications. They found precedents in smaller cases. And in March 2024, the announcement came. The reaction was triumphant. European leaders called it innovative economic statecraft. Financial newspapers praised the boldness. Ukraine celebrated. The narrative was beautifully simple. Russia will pay for its own war with money it can't defend. For about 2 weeks, it looked like a masterstroke. But what European strategists failed to consider, or maybe they considered and dismissed, was a simple question. What can Russia take from us? See, Russia had $105 billion in European banks, but European companies had been investing in Russia for 30 years. Factories, energy projects, infrastructure, supply chains. The math was about to get very uncomfortable for Brussels. Moscow didn't respond with angry statements. They didn't call emergency UN meetings. They responded with 3 moves so calculated, so devastating, that European finance ministers are still trying to understand what hit them. Let me walk you through each one. Move 1. Russia announced the nationalization of all European corporate assets on Russian territory. Not suspension of operations. Not temporary seizure. Permanent nationalization. The value? $120 billion. $15 billion more than Europe had seized. Let me make this concrete, because aggregate numbers hide human stories. Volkswagen had been operating in Russia since the 1990s, 30 years of patient investment. They built factories, developed supply chains, trained thousands of workers. In some Russian cities, VW plants were the largest employers. The Russian government took the factories, the equipment, the intellectual property, the brand rights. Volkswagen's Russian subsidiary simply ceased to exist as a German company. Siemens faced the same fate. They'd installed power infrastructure across Russia, built rail systems, supplied industrial equipment for decades. Russia didn't just take the physical assets, they took the maintenance contracts, the spare parts inventory, the service agreements, the technical documentation. Decades of market position eliminated overnight. Shell was even worse. They had major stakes in Russian energy projects. Sakhalin II, Arctic LNG, joint ventures with Gazprom worth tens of billions of dollars. Russia nationalized every foreign share. Shell went from equity partner to nothing without receiving a single ruble in compensation. And it wasn't just the big names. Hundreds of European companies, from mid-sized manufacturers to service providers, discovered their Russian operations had been confiscated. Danone lost dairy plants. Carlsberg lost breweries. Auchan lost retail operations. Renault lost automotive facilities. Every European company that had invested in Russia over 3 decades woke up to find their assets belonged to someone else. The immediate corporate losses were staggering, but the strategic consequences were worse because Russia didn't keep those assets idle. They sold them to Chinese companies at massive discounts. Think about what that means. European firms spent 30 years building market share in Russia, understanding local customers, developing distribution networks, training workforces. That knowledge, that market position, it can't be rebuilt quickly. It represents competitive advantage earned through decades of patient investment. Russia handed all of it to Chinese competitors for a fraction of its real value. Volkswagen's Russian market share didn't evaporate. It transferred to Chinese automakers who bought the factories and kept producing. Shell's energy projects didn't stop. They continued under Chinese ownership. Siemens's contracts didn't get cancelled. Chinese industrial firms took them over. Europe lost 30 years of investment and market position. China gained it in months. But Russia's retaliation didn't stop with nationalization. Move 2 was subtler, but potentially more damaging long term. Russia announced that all energy exports, all commodity sales, would only be settled in rubles or yuan. No euros accepted. Period. Now, you might think this would isolate Russia from global trade. Europe assumed it would. The entire Western financial system runs on dollars and euros. If Russia rejected euros, surely their customers would demand traditional currency settlements. They didn't refuse. They quietly switched. India set up ruble-rupee payment mechanisms. China was already using yuan for Russian transactions and expanded it. Turkey created similar bilateral arrangements. Within months, Russia was conducting the majority of its international trade without touching euros. The practical implication? Europe's economic sanctions, which depended on Russia needing access to euro-denominated finance, became far less effective. The leverage evaporated. But the signal to the world was even more significant. If Russia can trade with major economies without using Western currencies, what does that say about dollar and euro dominance? What does it say about the necessity of the Western financial system? The answer was becoming uncomfortable. It's optional, not ideal perhaps, but absolutely optional for countries willing to create alternatives. Then came Move 3, and this is the one that keeps European central bankers awake at night. Russia, together with BRICS partners, announced the creation of a $150 billion BRICS Plus Reserve Fund. The explicit purpose? Provide seizure-proof custody for member countries' reserves. Let me explain why this matters. Central banks hold foreign reserves for trade settlement and crisis management. Traditionally, those reserves are held in dollars and euros because they're liquid, stable, and accepted everywhere. But those reserves are held in Western financial institutions. New York banks, London clearinghouses, Frankfurt accounts, which means they can be frozen or seized if Western governments decide to do so. Russia demonstrated this vulnerability. One day your reserves are accessible, the next day they're frozen, the day after that they're confiscated and given to someone else. For any country watching, the lesson was terrifying. Your reserves are only yours until a Western government decides they're not. The BRICS Plus Reserve Fund offers an alternative, held outside Western jurisdiction, structured specifically to be seizure-proof, not denominated in dollars or euros. For countries worried about Western financial weaponization, it's exactly what they needed. And within weeks of the announcement, dozens of nations quietly began exploring participation. Saudi Arabia inquired about joining, not because they're anti-Western, but because they have $600 billion in reserves, and they just watched $105 billion get confiscated from another major oil exporter. If it can happen to Russia, why not to them? So, Europe lost $120 billion in corporate assets. Russia lost $105 billion in reserves. Both sides took massive hits. But, remember what I said at the beginning, China won everything, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Here's what Russia did with those $120 billion in seized European assets. They didn't keep them idle. They didn't try to run them with inexperienced Russian managers. They sold them to Chinese companies at massive discounts. Think about what that means strategically. European firms spent 30 years building market share in Russia, understanding local customers, developing distribution networks, training workforces, earning consumer trust. That knowledge, that market position, it can't be rebuilt quickly. It represents competitive advantage earned through decades of patient investment. Volkswagen's Russian market share didn't evaporate. It transferred to Chinese automakers who bought the factories and kept producing. Same workers, same supply chains, same customers. Just Chinese brands now. BYD, Geely, Chery, they're now dominant in markets VW spent 30 years cultivating. Shell's energy projects didn't stop. They continued under Chinese ownership. CNPC and Sinopec stepped into equity positions. Shell had spent billions securing. So let's tally what China gained. Market access. 30 years of European market development in Russia. Established customer relationships. Proven supply chains. Trained workforce. Strategic assets. Energy equity stakes worth tens of billions. Industrial infrastructure positions. Currency power. Yuan as alternative to euro in Russian trade. Foundation for further de-dollarization. Financial infrastructure. Integration of payment systems. Alternative to SWIFT. And China achieved all of this without firing a shot, imposing sanctions, making threats, or spending significant capital. The immediate corporate losses were staggering, but the strategic consequences are far worse. When Shell publicly states they'll never invest in Russia again, that makes sense. But they're also now cautious about China, about Brazil, about anywhere that might face future sanctions. This caution means reduced investment, reduced future revenue, reduced shareholder returns. But the deeper damage is to European financial credibility. Here's how it works. You're a reserve manager for Saudi Arabia's central bank. You have $600 billion in reserves. 20% is in euros. After watching Europe seize Russian reserves, you're uncomfortable. You don't panic sell everything immediately. But as euro bonds mature, you quietly shift. Instead of reinvesting 100% in euros, maybe you do 80% euros, 10% gold, 10% yuan. Now multiply this across dozens of central banks and sovereign wealth funds. Suddenly, European bond auctions become less oversubscribed. The EU needs to offer higher yields to attract buyers. Higher yields mean higher borrowing costs. Higher costs mean either higher taxes or reduced spending. Growth slows. German bond yields relative to U.S. Treasuries have widened from basically 0 to 40 to 50 basis points. On Germany's $2 trillion debt, that's billions in additional annual interest costs. Then there's the infrastructure dimension. The SWIFT system has been the backbone of global finance for 50 years. Russia was partially cut off from SWIFT in 2022. Initially, this seemed devastating, but Russia had an answer ready. SPFS, their domestic alternative, had been under development since 2014. By 2024, SPFS had over 500 participants, including banks from 20 countries. China's CIPS system integrated with SPFS. Suddenly, Russia and China could conduct trade completely outside Western financial infrastructure. In 2022, maybe 10% of Russian international trade settled outside SWIFT. By late 2024, that figure exceeded 60%. And it's not just Russia. Turkish banks are connected, Indian banks, Central Asian republics, Middle Eastern nations. Every country that connects to alternative payment systems reduces their dependence on Western-controlled infrastructure. The European Central Bank understands this threat. Internal documents show they're modeling scenarios where the euro loses 20 to 30% of its reserve currency share over the next decade. Less demand for euros means lower euro value. Lower value means higher import costs. Higher costs mean inflation or reduced consumption. European living standards decline. Reserve currency status isn't about interest rates or monetary policy. It's about trust. Europe broke that trust. Some European policymakers are privately admitting the seizure was a mistake. not publicly. Public admission would be political suicide. But in closed meetings, they acknowledge the costs exceeded the benefits. The problem is, there's no way to reverse it. The assets are gone. The precedent is set. So what are the lessons? Lesson 1. Financial weapons are double-edged swords. When you weaponize the financial system, you don't just hurt your target, you damage the credibility of the system itself. Lesson 2. Always calculate retaliation scenarios. Europe asked, can we seize these assets? They should have asked, what can Russia seize from us? The math was never in Europe's favor. Lesson 3. Watch for the third player. Europe and Russia were so focused on each other, neither saw China quietly positioning to exploit the chaos. Best case scenario, Euro credibility stabilizes at a new, lower level of trust. Worst case scenario, this is the beginning of a spiral. Reduced confidence leads to capital flight. Capital flight leads to higher borrowing costs. Higher costs lead to economic weakness. The European Union was built on economic integration as a path to peace and prosperity. The irony is that weaponizing that integration might destroy the prosperity that made it possible. Historians will look back at this moment as a turning point, not because of what Europe did to Russia, but because of what Europe did to itself. They'll see a case study in strategic myopia, in political expediency overriding long-term thinking. The $105 billion seizure was supposed to fund 1 year of Ukraine support. Instead, it may have cost Europe $120 billion in corporate assets, decades of market position, credibility as a financial safe haven, reserve currency status, and strategic independence from China. In modern economic warfare, the most devastating weapon is often the one you use against yourself. Let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake here. We're watching the real-time erosion of a financial system that took 70 years to build. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the global reserve currency. The euro later joined as a major reserve currency, backed by the credibility of European institutions. That credibility rested on one fundamental promise. Your assets are safe here. They're protected by law, by institutions, by predictable rules. That promise just got shattered, and the ripple effects are only beginning. Think about emerging markets holding euro reserves: Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia. They're watching this unfold and asking themselves a simple question: are we next? If a geopolitical dispute arises, will our reserves disappear too? The answer used to be no. That would never happen. Now the answer is, well, it depends. That uncertainty alone is enough to drive diversification. And diversification away from euros means reduced demand, which means a weaker currency, which means higher costs for European imports, which means lower living standards for European citizens. The corporate sector is drawing similar conclusions. Why invest in markets where your assets can be confiscated based on political decisions made thousands of miles away? European companies built their Russian operations over 30 years based on the assumption that property rights would be respected, that contracts would be honored, that international law would prevail. Those assumptions turned out to be wrong, and now those same companies have to reassess every international investment through this new lens. The result is inevitable: less risk-taking, less expansion, less growth. And in a globalized economy, less growth means falling behind competitors who are willing to take those risks. Chinese companies, now armed with 30 years of European market development in Russia, don't have those same concerns. Meanwhile, the BRICS alternative is gaining momentum faster than most Western analysts predicted. When the announcement came, many dismissed it as political posturing. These countries can't possibly build an alternative to the Western financial system, but they're doing exactly that. And they're not starting from scratch. China's been developing these capabilities for over a decade. Russia has been preparing since Crimea. They knew this day would come. They were ready. Europe wasn't. The strategic miscalculation wasn't just about the immediate asset seizure, it was about failing to anticipate how Russia and China would respond, failing to calculate the long-term costs, and failing to understand that financial credibility, once damaged, is almost impossible to restore. The world is watching, and they're learning a lesson Europe didn't intend to teach. The Western financial system can't be trusted to remain neutral. It's a weapon that can be turned against you at any moment. That realization is fundamentally reshaping global finance. And Europe, by seizing those $105 billion, just accelerated a process that will ultimately diminish its own power and prosperity for decades to come. This is how empires end. Not with dramatic collapse, but with steady erosion of the mechanisms that made them dominant. The parallels to historical precedents are striking. When Britain weaponized its financial system during the Suez Crisis, it accelerated the decline of sterling as a reserve currency. When the United States froze Iranian assets in 1979, it planted seeds of doubt about dollar safety that took decades to fully manifest. But Europe's action in 2024 is different in scale and scope. They didn't just freeze assets temporarily. They permanently confiscated sovereign reserves and transferred them to a third party. That's a precedent that changes everything. It tells every country holding reserves in Western institutions that those reserves are conditional. They're yours only as long as you align with Western foreign policy. And for many countries, that's an unacceptable risk. The shift away from Western financial infrastructure won't happen overnight. It will be gradual, quiet, and relentless. Central banks will diversify. Companies will seek alternative payment systems. Countries will build parallel institutions. And with each small shift, Europe's financial power diminishes. This changes everything for the next generation of global finance. The cost will be paid for Generat.